Hi guys, welcome back to Cloud Tech. In this video, we are going to mark the interview which was conducted by Capgemini. It was one round of interview, and the candidate was having around 2.6 years of experience working as a Java developer. So let's get started with the interview. Yeah, hi. Can you explain me your skill set and what is the project on which you worked on?
Hello. So I have 2.6 years of experience working in core Java, Spring Boot, and microservices. I have worked in various domains. I have experience of banking domain, and I also have experience of insurance domain. So my project was basically a microservices architecture project, and there were around 10 microservices which used to communicate with each other. So that is my background and the project that I worked upon.
Okay, so let's get started with the interview. So can you tell me what is the difference between method overloading and method overriding in Java?
Okay, so method overloading is where there are multiple methods with different parameters. So there is one method print with one parameter as integer, and there is another method print with two parameters as integer. So method having same name but different number of parameters is known as method overloading in Java. And method overriding is where there is a parent class and there is a child class that extends from the parent class. And then I have one method known as print in my parent class, and I override. I have the exact same signature in my child class. So in that case, I override the behavior of my parent class method into a child class. So this is known as method overriding, and this concept is also known as dynamic binding.
Okay, perfect. So you must have used interfaces in your application, right?
Yes.
So can you tell me what is an interface?
Interface is a contract. So, for example, if there is an interface, so generally we just declare the method signature in the interface. And after Java 8, we can also have default methods in our interfaces. So it is a contract. It is a contract which class has to fulfill. So if I have an interface and a class implements that interface, then class has to provide the signature and implementation of all the methods that are declared in the interface.
Okay. And what is an abstract class in Java?
Abstract class is where you cannot instantiate object of that class because it has one or more abstract methods in it. So that is the reason you cannot instantiate. Consider example, you are writing a GUI library and there is one class known as component. So you cannot instantiate the component, but there is one more class which is button extends component. So button is a component which you can instantiate. When I say component, you can't imagine anything. But when I say button, you can imagine that it's a button. So abstract class is where you have one or more abstract methods declared in that class.
Okay, so you are saying abstract method. Abstract method means the method which has only signature, right? And
Yeah, the
interface
method.
also has only methods which are abstract methods. So what is the difference between these two, abstract class and interface?
Okay. So interface before Java 8, it can only have method signatures, but after Java 8, it can have default methods. But in case of abstract class, it is combination of methods and signatures. So there might be multiple methods which are common across classes. So those methods are written in your abstract class, and that can be used by all the implementing subclasses. But in case of interface before Java 8, you can't have this feature. But after Java 8, you can have default methods.
So how do you decide when to use abstract classes or when to use the interface?
Okay. So generally as a best practice, we generally go for interfaces because one class, if it has to extend from multiple classes, so that is not possible in case of Java. So what we do whenever there is a class and we know that class has multiple contracts, so we declare interfaces, interface one and interface two, and then class implements interface one and interface two. So when I extend from a class, I can't do this. But when I use interfaces, then implementing multiple interfaces are possible. So when this is the scenario, I go for interface. And when I'm clear that my class only has one responsibility, then I extend from abstract class.
Okay, perfect. So how do you handle exceptions in Java?
Okay. So in Java, whenever we execute code, so there is a possibility of something going wrong. For example, I am trying to read from the file, and that file does not exist. So that this is a scenario where file not found exception might happen. The exception is any abnormal behavior that occurs during program execution. So there are two types of exception. One is your compile time exception, and one is your runtime exception. Compile time exception, you have to handle it compulsorily in your code. So there is a try catch block. So whatever you write in try block will be executed, and while executing code in a try block, if something goes wrong, then your flow goes to the catch block. And in catch block, you either do logger dot info log, you print it into your log file, or you handle it differently. This is compile time exception. A runtime exception is where there is some problem with your logic. For example, arithmetic exception. So if you divide by 0, then arithmetic exception might happen. Or null pointer exception. If any object reference is null and you try to access method on that reference, then null pointer exception might happen. So you generally don't handle a runtime exception. That is problem with your logic. You change the logic and that exception disappear.
Okay,
These are
so
the two ways we handle exception.
okay, so do you know the finally block in exception handling?
Yeah, finally. So
So
we
what
have
is the use of that finally block?
okay. So there's a try block, there is a catch block, and at the end there is a finally block. So generally it is guaranteed that finally will get executed, but there are one or two scenarios in which finally might not get executed. But any cleanup activity, for example, closing connections, releasing file handles, these types of things we do in finally block. And when system.exit happens, whenever the program exits, only in that case finally is not executed. Apart from that, finally is always executed.
Okay, fine. Do you have used collections in your project?
Yes, I have used collections.
So what are the collections which you have used in your project?
I have used ArrayList, I have used LinkList, I have used Hashmap, I have used hash tables.
Okay, so can you tell me the difference between Hashmap and Hashtable?
Okay, I think Hashmap, Hashmap. One of them is thread-safe. I'm not sure which one is that, but both of them are key value pair. So we store key and value. So consider Hashmap. Hashmap works on the principle of bucketing. So you calculate the hash for the incoming key, and then for that key you store the value. So when you want to retrieve that thing, you again calculate the hash, and based on the hash, you know the bucket, and from that bucket, you just retrieve the value. So it gives you O of 1 time for retrieval.
Okay, and what is the difference between ArrayList and linked list?
Okay, so ArrayList is backed by an array. So whenever you want to store something in contiguous manner, then you go for ArrayList. And whenever you want to store something in a scattered manner in memory, then you go for LinkList. So whenever there is retrieval operation, so ArrayList is fast for retrieving, and for insertion and deletion in between, LinkList is faster. So you have to make the decision based on the scenario that you are handling.
Okay, perfect. So can you tell me the difference between equal operator and equals method in string?
Okay. So equal to operator checks for the reference, uh, and it does not check for the value. So if there are two objects in memory, and if two references are pointing to the same object, in that case, equal to operator returns true. But consider if there are two objects and we want to check the actual content of both the objects. In that case, we go for equals method and we don't use equal to operator. So to check the references, we use equal to operator, and to check the content of the object, we check for we use equals method.
Okay. And do you know what is meant by immutability in Java?
Yeah. So immutable means once you create the object, the content of that object cannot be changed. So string is a classic example of immutable object in Java. So you might say there's a string ABC and I append PQR to this string, then the result becomes ABC PQR. But the original ABC object is never changed. A new object is created with the value ABC PQR. So you are not modifying the existing object, you are creating a new object whenever any modification operation happens. So this is known as immutability in Java, and string is the classic example of it.
Okay, so let us consider I want to create my own class which I needs to make it immutable. So
Okay.
how to
Uh,
create it?
Right. So I'll try to answer this question. The first thing that I'll do is make all the fields private. So I have a class, for example, person, and in that person, I have a field name as age, known as age. Then I'll mark that field as private. Then I won't provide setters. I will not give setters. I will just set the value from constructor. So I'll provide the constructor. So while creating an object, I'll accept age, and that is the only point where I can set the age. And I will give getters, but I won't give setters. So this will ensure that whenever the object is created, only at that stage, age is set, and after that, there is no way of modifying the age instance variable. So this is how I can make my class immutable.
Okay. So do you have experience working on Spring Boot?
Yes, I've used Spring Boot in my application.
Okay, which version of Spring Boot you are using recently?
I was using Spring Boot 3.
Okay. So can you tell me what is meant by dependency injection or IOC inversion of control?
Okay, so inversion of control is where instead of we adding dependency, it is the framework which gives the dependency for an object. So consider this example. There is employee class, and within employee, there is address, or there is a car class, and within car, there is list of tires, for example. Then while creating a car class, uh, it is the it is the duty of your framework to provide to create tires and provide tires to this car class. So instead of we manually adding the instance of tires into my car, framework does that. So this is known as inversion of control, and providing the dependency is known as dependency injection.
Okay. So have you any experience working on earlier version of Spring MVC and the currently you are using Spring Boot, right? So what is the difference between this earlier version of Spring and now you are using Spring Boot? So why
Okay,
you are using
so
it?
right. So earlier we used to use Spring, but the problem is to create one application and to add to make it to make REST APIs. Generally, there were a lot of steps. The first step is we have to create Spring application. The second is we have to add all the dependencies. And generally, while adding dependencies, those dependencies were not compatible with each other. So if I add one jar, and if I add another jar which is not incompatible, then application stops working. So it was cumbersome, and there was lot of boilerplate thing that we were repeatedly doing in case of Spring, and we have to provide all the properties manually. Then what Spring Boot did, you have to just provide starter dependencies, and Spring Boot knows, for example, Spring Boot starter web. If I add this, then my application knows that I'm trying to create a REST API for web, and it brings all the under the hood dependencies for my Spring Boot application. to make it REST compliant. So all the boilerplate things are reduced in Spring Boot, and Spring Boot also bootstraps a lot of properties. Then you only deal with a few properties that you are interested in, rather than providing all the properties while building your application.
Okay, so when your application gets deployed on server, on which port number it starts by default?
Okay, so by default, it starts on 8080, and it uses Tomcat by default. And if you want to change it, then server.port is the property. You can use this to change the port on which it starts.
Okay, and if I don't want to deploy my application on Tomcat, instead Tomcat, I need to deploy it on some other server. How do you do it? Or where do you deploy your application in your project?
Okay, so Tomcat is embedded into Spring Boot, but if you don't want to use Tomcat, you can use Jetty. So Jetty is one alternative for your deployment. And if you don't want to deploy in Jetty also, then what you can do, you can take your artifact as a WAR file instead of jar file, and take any application container, and you can deploy your application in that application container. For example, JBoss, you can also do that.
Okay, perfect. Do you know the profiles in Spring Boot?
Yeah. Uh, so profiles is where you have classes, and there are multiple environments in your while using your application. There are multiple environments: dev environment, production environment, test environment. So you can have conditional classes. For example, if there is dev environment, then I need the instance of this class. If there is production environment, I need instance of this class. So to do conditional creation of beans, we go for profiles. But generally, if you have profiles, it is difficult to maintain, and the best practice is generally to avoid profiles unless it is absolutely necessary to use it.
Okay, you mentioned that you have experience on microservices as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so can you tell me what are the main components of microservices, or can you tell me what is the use of API gateway specifically?
Okay. So generally, what happens in case of microservices architecture, there are for each business related functionality, there is one micro project which is either in Spring Boot or any other language, and there are multiple projects running on different port on the same machine or on different machine. So if you want to access the REST APIs of all the application, then you need URL and port. In short, you need address of each microservice, but client cannot have address of each microservice. So generally there is API gateway. So client only knows the address of API gateway, and API gateway knows for this request which microservice to contact. So the basic duty of API gateway is to accept the request from client, and then redirect that request to appropriate microservice, and then return the response back to the client. So there are various other functionalities which API gateway handles. API gateway also handles authentication and authorization. API gateway also handles rate limiting. So if multiple requests are coming from one client, which is not acceptable, then you can add that logic in API gateway. So Zool is common example of API gateway.
Okay, so how this API gateway knows which service needs to be executed at backend?
Okay. So for example, consider this. There is payment service from the client. What we can do, we can give address of API gateway HTTP colon. Consider my API gateway is running on jobreadytrainings.com colon 8080 slash payments. So after slash, I give payments, and then I hit the endpoint slash checkout. So I know from this payment belong to my payment microservice, and I can configure this in my API gateway. Whenever there is payments in the URL, then you have to go to the payment microservice.
Okay, do you know discovery server?
Yeah, discovery server. We have service discovery in our application. So do you want the flow of that, how it works?
Yes, you can explain it, or you can tell me which discovery server you are using and what is exactly use of it.
Okay, so consider this. And generally in microservices, we have multiple instances of each microservice. Now, consider this, we have multiple instances of our order microservice. We have 3 instances, for example. We have multiple instances of payment microservice, 2, 3 instances. Now, all the microservices run on different host and different port. So if my order service wants to call payments microservice, in that case, I cannot hard code the URL of payment microservice in my order microservice. So generally what happens, we have a centralized component known as service discovery, and each microservice while starting up registers with this service discovery. Now whenever anyone wants to access any service, then instead of hard coding the value, we go to service discovery and we ask for the microservice. For example, order service goes to service discovery and asks for address of payment microservice. In that case, service discovery knows the address and it gives back the URL with host and port. And then order service calls payment microservice. So this is how the flow of service discovery works.
Okay. So how these services communicate with each other?
Okay. So generally the services communicate with each other through REST template. So it's a REST call over the network. So it is generally best practice to do REST call. We can also do inter-process communication, but in case of microservices, REST template is useful. We can also use web client to call another microservice. So REST template or web client, or you can do IPC, but IPC is not recommended.
Okay. And how do you handle the fault tolerance in your microservices?
Okay, so fault tolerance, there are 2 cases of fault tolerance. One is where your service is either slow or your service is either down. Okay, so when your service is down, we make use of Hystrix. So nowadays there is something called as resilience 4J or something. We have that jar included in our application. So whenever there is problem with the method and that method is unable to complete, unable to give the response, in that case we provide the alternate method which has hard-coded response. So that hard-coded response is sent to the caller, and this ensures that there is no cascading failure, because in microservices one service calls another service calls some other service. So if there is failure, then that failure is cascaded throughout. We don't want this, so that is the reason we use Hystrix or resilience
Okay.
for fault tolerance.
Okay. And how do you monitor these microservices?
Monitoring microservices, we monitor microservices using 2 things. One is Spring Cloud Admin, and the other one is we can use a Prometheus or Actuator.
Okay. So actuator, what is the use of this actuator? Can you tell
Mm,
me few endpoints which you are using?
Yeah, so Actuator is where you have to add your Actuator jar, Springboot starter Actuator. And once you add this, then there are certain endpoints. For example, slash status. So when you, for that URL on which your microservice is running, if you do slash status, it provides you OK, all 200. There are multiple endpoints. For example, how much memory consumption is currently happening for that microservice. So there are endpoints for this. How many beans are created? So there are endpoints for this as well. How many failed requests happened? So these are some of the endpoints.
Okay. Okay, I'm done from my side. It was nice talking to you. Do you have any questions for me?
No, I don't have any questions. It was
Okay.
nice talking to you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Bye bye.